At last, the attackers broke into Eregion with ruin and devastation, and captured the chief object of Sauron's assault, the House of the Myrdain, where were their smithies and their treasures. Celebrimbor, desperate, himself withstood Sauron on the steps of the great door of the Myrdain, but he was grappled and taken captive. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we have the fall of Eregion, and what exactly happened during that battle, as I don't quite believe that recent adaptations of it have done it justice exactly. Related articles and videos may be found in the description and cards, my friends. Thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Let's begin our tale. Our story starts around 1600 of the Second Age. The Rings of Power, all of them. First, the 16 rings that would eventually go to men and dwarves, then the 3 elven rings and the 1 ring, had all been crafted. The elves would soon realize that they had been deceived by Annatar, who was, in truth, Sauron. And in turn, Sauron came to find that the elven rings had been made without his knowledge or command. So while they would still fall under his influence and the influence of the One Ring, as they were made with Sauron's teachings of his craft, he had never touched them nor corrupted them directly, and so they were made with and for good intentions. While Sauron prepared to make his war of the elves in Sauron, raising his armies in Mordor, which I go into more depth on as an overall war in another video, Celebrimbor went to Lorinand, later Lothlorien, and spoke with Galadriel, for he admired her greatly. It is said in the Unfinished Tales that they should have destroyed the Rings of Power at this time, which certainly would have changed the fate of the world, but they failed to find the strength. Galadriel recommended the removal of the elven rings from Eregion, that Sauron may never find them, and they may never be used. This advice was given while Sauron still had the One Ring, of course, so Galadriel made this suggestion without knowing he would eventually have the One Ring taken from him, and the 3 would be safe for the elves to use. She received Nenya, the Ring of Water, and, as it existed without even being worn, strengthened the realm of Lorinand, and also her desire for the sea, and it diminished her joy in Middle-earth. Celebrimbor would send Narya, the Ring of Fire, and Vilya, the Ring of Air, to Gil-galad. Depending on the notes of Tolkien that we use here, he either gave Narya to Círdan here, or it would go to the ship right after the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Age. But the Elven Rings were sent away, and Sauron would move his forces over Kelenarthon, later Rohan, towards Eregion in 1695. High King Gil-galad would send an army under the control of Elrond Half-Elven to reinforce the elven realm of East Eriador. Celeborn, who also lived in Eregion at this time, not wanting to cross through Moria due to his dislike of the dwarves, was apart from his wife and daughter, Galadriel and Celebrian. And he led a vanguard of Eregion's elves against Sauron's forces coming up through the lands of Dunland, Enedwaith, and perhaps Minhiriath. Though Celeborn drove Sauron's host back, it seemed, and even joined with Elrond and his army, it was only a part of Sauron's forces, for the Dark Lord's true numbers overwhelmed the elves utterly. They were large enough to simultaneously hold off the elves of Celeborn and Elrond, as well as find a way to break into Eregion, which they did in 1697. Celebrimbor and his elves were almost entirely cut off from all allies, and Eregion, its capital of Ostin Ethil, was overrun by Sauron's forces. The prize was the House of the Myrdain, where the Rings of Power, save the One Ring, were forged. Celebrimbor stood with what was left of his elves and smiths likely on the very steps of that house, as Sauron's host closed in around him. The grandson of Feanor fought valiantly, but in the end was taken captive, and his house was ransacked and destroyed. The 9 rings and other smaller works of the ringcrafters, perhaps those lesser essays in ringcraft that we know little about, were taken by Sauron. But the 3 and 7 rings were hidden from him. Celebrimbor was tortured and tormented, and eventually Sauron learned where the 7 were bestowed. Now, some lore tells us that the dwarves actually received their rings directly from the elven smiths, which would have had to have been before this. But while there is no indication that the 7 rings were necessarily taken here by Sauron, it may be that Sauron did come across them, only to distribute them to the dwarves himself somehow later. But regardless, if they had already been distributed, or Sauron learned of their location here and would do that later, Celebrimbor would not give up the 3 elven rings, for they were particularly special to him, and were made differently. So Sauron put the elf to death, and guessed who the rings might have gone to, likely to Gil-galad and Lindon. Filling Celebrimbor's body with orc arrows and having his orcs, in their barbarity, display Celebrimbor's corpse on a pole as a horrific banner, he turned his forces towards Elrond and Celeborn. Easily, these elves would have been overrun and slain, had the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and elves of Lorinond, who came under the command of Prince Amroth, not opened the doors of Durin and hindered Sauron's forces from behind, allowing Elrond and Celeborn to escape northwards, as would many elves who were not hunted down in the next few years, all of whom would have been slain if not for this act of friendship and alliance. When they retreated and closed the doors once more, the dwarves would forever earn the ire and hatred of Sauron and his orcs. Sauron commanded his orcs to harry the dwarves wherever they might, leading of course to future conflicts. The elves came to a hidden dell where they would wait and outlast Sauron's storm, as he turned his eyes towards Lindon in the west, and this would become the hidden valley of Imladris, or Rivendell, where Elrond and his future father-in-law stayed until the war's end. And so the fall of Eregion was over, many wonders of the Second Age lost in the destruction. But there was still hope for the elves, and their many friendships and their resilience against evil. Please check out that other video on the entire war for that, but as for this tale, we come now to its end. As a land, Eregion would continue to be known for the lore that it once held, and the memories of the rings that would go on to so greatly impact the Third Age. The fate of Celebrimbor would be the final known end to any descendant of Feanor, and the end to the last great craftsman of the elves, whose works would, for better and for worse, shape the world of Middle-earth forever. From the fall of Eregion, we see that we are at times faced with a choice to hold or flee to fight another day. There's never an exact right or wrong answer per se, but we should be sure of our choice once we have made it. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this look at the fall of Eregion. What are your thoughts on it? Let me know in the comments below. This certainly mirrors Morgoth's invasion of Formenos in some ways in the Elder Days, and how the riches of Feanor were taken and Feanor's father was murdered by the Dark Lord. It is another loss of a great elf who changed the fate of the world with his ambition in Celebrimbor, and it's worth looking at in the grand scheme of the Lord of the Rings tale. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some What It Were United Cutlery, Lord of the Rings swords, statues, and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch. Join our memberships and Patreon for access to our Discord server and our monthly podcast. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons and YouTube members, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Brian Hunley, Peter Shepard, John Hume, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Andrew Carlisle, and Zoomi. Thank you all so much for continuing to support the channel. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the free peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with a video on what I will be watching and looking for in the War of the Rohirrim, which comes out in the next 2 weeks. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.